They thought he was just an old blind dog, forgotten by the world, his eyes lost to war and time. But when Sheriff Rachel Monroe vanished in the woods of Bear Creek, it wasn't a search team, a radio, or a gun that found her. It was Major, the limping, blindfolded, and guided by something deeper than sight. At the same time, a boy who hadn't spoken in 2 years whispered, "Don't stop him," and a grandmother felt it in her chest. This wasn't just a rescue. This was something holy, a miracle wrapped in fur, memory, and quiet footsteps. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The town of Bear Creek, Wyoming, woke beneath a heavy quilt of fog that pressed low over the rooftops and rolled thick between the pine-covered ridges. It was early autumn, and the crisp air carried the scent of damp leaves, wood smoke, and something quieter, something ancient and watchful. The streets were mostly empty save for a few parked trucks and the soft flicker of porch lights barely cutting through the mist. Out past the town's edge, where the gravel roads gave way to forest trails, the trees stood tall and dripping, their silhouettes swallowed by morning haze. Officer Rachel Monroe guided her patrol truck carefully around a bend, tires crunching over gravel slick with dew. At 34, Rachel was a woman who carried strength in quiet ways. She was tall, just under 6 feet, with a lean, athletic build shaped by years of physical training. Her long, dark auburn hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and beneath the brim of her sheriff's department cap, her sharp hazel eyes scanned the thick woods ahead. Rachel had transferred to Bear Creek just over a year ago from Denver, where a hostage standoff gone wrong had left her shaken and questioning her place in the field. Her partner, a fellow officer and close friend, had not survived the standoff. Since then, Rachel had chosen smaller towns and quieter roads, hoping to find peace in the silence. But the ghosts had followed. She had learned to carry them quietly, the same way she carried her badge, not as pride, but as promise. She parked near the trailhead at Alder Hollow, a spot locals used mostly for hiking or deer watching. Today, she was responding to a report from a retired logger who claimed to have seen homemade snares, wire traps, set just off the trail. Poaching wasn't common in Bear Creek, but it happened. And Rachel never dismissed old men with sharp eyes and too many hunting seasons under their belt. The fog swallowed her as she stepped out. She wore a rain-slicked patrol jacket, cargo pants, and black boots. Her hand instinctively checked the sidearm on her belt, though she didn't expect trouble, just caution. Always caution. The air was wet and still, pine needles stuck to her boots, and the forest around her gave no sound. No bird call, no breeze, only the distant drip of water from high branches, deeper into the woods. The trees thickened. Rachel passed 2 trail markers, then a cluster of birch trunks leaning like whispered secrets. That's when she noticed the shift, a silence within the silence, a kind of stillness that came before storms, or something worse. She turned. Too late. The blow struck hard against the side of her head. Stars burst behind her eyes, her knees buckled, and her world spun sideways. She felt herself being dragged, arms pinned, the ground shifted beneath her, then bark pressed cruelly into her back. Her wrists were tied behind a tree, tight. Practiced knots, her sidearm was gone. Voices murmured in a dialect she couldn't place. 2, maybe 3 men. She caught the word move, and then nothing. Then footsteps fading. Rachel opened her eyes slowly. Blood trickled into her brow. The fog had thickened, and the forest now loomed darker. Her breath came shallow. She tugged against the ropes, but they held. Whoever did this hadn't rushed. She was alone. Or so she thought. On the opposite side of Bear Creek, nestled behind a picket fence and a garden gone wild with late-season marigolds, the Parker house stood like a stubborn memory. Inside, 10-year-old Evan Parker sat cross-legged on the living room rug, sketching a scene from his head: a large pine tree, a winding path, and a dog wearing a bandana. His fingers smudged charcoal onto the paper, eyes intense but unfocused. Evan hadn't spoken a word in almost 2 years. Not since the accident that took both his parents on a snowy highway just outside Casper. Evan was small for his age, with mop-like brown hair that often fell into his eyes and made him appear more serious than he was. He rarely looked people in the eye. He didn't like crowds, loud noises, or changes in routine, but he drew, every day and every day. His sketches grew clearer, sharper, like visions waiting to be understood. In the corner of the room, resting on a worn fleece mat, lay Major. Major was a German shepherd nearing 11 years old. He was large, with a thick coat of sable fur now graying at the muzzle and legs. A golden yellow blindfold, soft cloth wrapped gently over his eyes, marked the change he had suffered after his final mission. Once, a celebrated military K-9 major had lost his vision in a night ambush in Kandahar. He'd been retired, adopted quietly, and brought here by a rescue program. Since arriving at the Parker house, he had mostly kept to himself, moving slowly, ears twitching at every sound. That morning, something shifted. Major lifted his head sharply, ears erect. He sniffed the air, then stood, stiff at first, then steadier. Evan paused his drawing, Major's head tilted slightly, as if listening to something just outside the edge of hearing. He took a step toward the door, then another. Major Helen Parker's voice echoed gently from the kitchen. Helen, 66, was a widow with silver-streaked auburn hair, always pinned in a tight bun. She had a sharp gaze softened by years as a field nurse during the Gulf War. Her body moved slowly these days, but her mind missed nothing. She was the kind of woman who didn't raise her voice but always got listened to. Since Evan came to live with her, Helen had learned to watch for the unspoken. She trusted instincts more than words. When she saw Major standing at the door, posture alert, tail straight, not wagging, she stepped forward. "He hasn't done that in months," she murmured. Evan stood too, alarmed. Then he did something unexpected. He whispered, "Don't stop him." Helen blinked. It was the first thing Evan had said since the funeral. Major stepped forward again, paw touching the floorboard, like a blind man testing unfamiliar ground. His nose twitched, and then, with a final pause, he nosed open the door and slipped out into the fog. Helen stared after him. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The fog in Bear Creek thickened as the morning hours passed. It lay heavy on rooftops and drifted low through the pines, painting the forest in shades of silent gray. The trees seemed to breathe mist, their trunks tall and unmoving, while the forest floor soaked up the cold like an old wound refusing to heal. From the porch of the Parker house, Major stood still, facing the trees. The blind German shepherd's fur was damp from the early chill, his breath puffing gently from a gray-speckled muzzle. His yellow blindfold, faded at the edges, wrapped carefully across his eyes, the cloth frayed but clean. His ears twitched as he listened not just for sound, but for something deeper, something beneath the world of hearing. 11 years old and worn by time, Major had long since grown used to silence. Blindness had become part of him, no longer a weakness, just another sense repurposed. But this morning, something stirred in his chest, something old and familiar, a pull like a forgotten command echoing from deep within his bones. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Helen Parker stepped out in her thick burgundy sweater and wool house slippers, her hands still dusted with flour from the morning's biscuit dough. Her gray hair was twisted into a neat bun, a pencil stuck through the center like an anchor. She watched Major with quiet suspicion, her breath catching as he lifted one paw and placed it gently onto the top porch step. "Major," she called softly. The dog didn't respond, at least not in any way she understood. He simply stepped down again, one paw, then the next. Inside the house, the sharp sound of a chair scraping echoed from the kitchen. Evan Parker stood in the doorway, holding his sketchpad against his chest. The 10-year-old had grown taller in the last year, though he still looked small inside his oversized green hoodie and bare feet on cold wood floors. His brown hair hung in quiet curls around his face, and his expression was unreadable as he watched Major disappear into the mist. Helen turned. "Evan, don't worry, he's just wandering like he does sometimes. He'll come back." The boy didn't move. Major reached the edge of the yard, his paws pressed into soft, dewy grass and then onto the harder earth of the woods beyond. He paused beneath the trees. The shift in air was immediate, darker, deeper, colder. But he didn't hesitate. He walked. Helen stepped down onto the porch, crossing her arms. She squinted after the dog's vanishing shape. "That's farther than usual," she muttered. Then Evan spoke. "Don't stop him." Helen froze. 2 words. His voice. It wasn't loud, or confident, or clear, but it was his, gravelly from disuse. A whisper barely above the rustling wind, but it cut through the fog more sharply than any shout. She turned to him, stunned. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Evan's eyes were locked on the forest's edge. His sketchpad still clenched to his chest. His fingers trembled just slightly. But he didn't speak again. Helen stared at him for a long moment, heart thudding. Then she looked back toward the forest, where Major had now disappeared entirely. The forest had swallowed him whole. The first pine branch brushed across Major's snout as he passed into the thick wood. He didn't flinch. He simply kept moving, body low and careful. Each paw step was quiet, deliberate, guided by rhythm and scent rather than sight. He moved like a shadow, learning how to breathe. Faint smells clung to the dampness. Sap, moss, old deer trails. But none of it was what called him. No. What pulled at him now was something softer. Memory. Rachel Monroe. He remembered her in ways that had nothing to do with vision. Her voice had been different than others, sharper, but with warmth in the middle. Her footsteps had a certain pause before they stopped. Her hands always trembled for a second before she clipped on his leash. He remembered the time she cried, not loudly, but in shivers, after the mountain blast. How she had cupped his face and whispered, "You're still with me?" And now, he was. She had saved him from the pit of that explosion, from a life of pain and metal cages. She had refused to give up on him when his vision failed. Now, even in this faraway place, some part of her still whispered to him, not with words, but with something stronger. And so, he walked, one step at a time, through bramble and bush, through fog and stillness. On the porch, Helen had sat down in her rocking chair. Her hands were still trembling. Evan had returned to the living room, where he now sat on the rug with his sketch pad open again. He was drawing, not quick doodles as he had done in the past, but something slower, more focused. A tree, a shape curled at its base, a bandana. Helen couldn't explain what had just happened. Her grandson had not spoken in nearly 2 years, not since the accident that shattered their family and turned their world into quiet routine. She had accepted his silence like one accepts winter, painful, long, but expected. And yet, here he was. 2 words that cracked through the wall she'd spent months learning to live behind. She stood up again, walking quietly to the doorframe. She looked toward the woods. The fog hadn't moved. She pressed one hand gently to her chest and whispered, "Not to Evan, not to anyone in particular. Please, bring her back." The forest around Rachel Monroe was a cathedral of silence. The sun had climbed somewhere above the mist, but under the pines, it made no difference. Light barely filtered through the overlapping canopy. Shadows shifted slowly with the breeze, as if the woods were holding their breath. Rachel slumped against the rough bark of a pine tree. Wrists scraped raw, arms pinned behind her. The ropes had been tied with practiced precision, tight enough to cut off circulation, loose enough to let her stay conscious. Her uniform was damp, her body sore from hours bound in the cold. Blood had crusted on her brow where the blow had landed, and her breath came shallow, as if the forest itself pressed on her chest. The men had left her hours ago. She could still hear their footsteps echoing in memory. The crunch of boots on wet leaves, the mutter of voices in a language she didn't understand. They had taken her sidearm, her radio, and even her belt, left her to disappear in the quietest way possible. Rachel was strong, had been strong all her life, but her strength was ebbing. Her training told her to stay calm, conserve energy, focus on detail. But the cold was creeping into her bones, and her fingers had long since gone numb. She tilted her head upward, eyes fluttering open toward the fog-veiled canopy. A dry whisper escaped her lips, a sound more memory than speech. "Major." It wasn't a call, not really. It was a fragment, a last thought shaped into breath. a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Then she closed her eyes again, letting the silence fall. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Major moved like dusk. His paws brushed the forest floor with almost no sound, though blind. He navigated with an ancient kind of knowing, each shift in air pressure, each scent on the breeze, a compass more accurate than any map. His body ached, his right hind leg dragged slightly behind him, stiff from the old injury. But he didn't slow. He had caught it a few moments earlier, something more than scent, more than memory. Her. It was a trace of skin, blood, and warmth. And it was close. He stepped through a narrow break in the undergrowth, ears forward. The forest seemed to hush as he emerged into a small clearing where the pine trees formed a tight ring. And there, barely visible through the veil of mist, was the shape of a human slumped at the base of a tree. She didn't stir. Major moved slowly, carefully, until the tip of his nose brushed the toe of her boot. Her scent flooded his world. His breath caught in his chest. He was sure. Rachel. Rachel's eyes opened again. At first, she thought she was hallucinating. She felt something warm press against her leg, then a nose, cold and damp. Nudged her knee. Her heart stuttered. She tried to turn her head. "Major," she croaked. The dog let out a low breath, almost a huff, and moved behind her, his thick body brushing against the bark of the tree. He sniffed at her wrists. Then again, his teeth, dulled with age, caught the edge of the rope. He tugged gently, then harder. Rachel flinched at the sudden pressure, but then she understood. He was trying to free her. "Easy. Buddy," she whispered, voice hoarse. "I'm right here." He kept at it. The rope didn't snap at once. It frayed, slowly, thread by thread. Between tugs, Major paused to lick her hand, checking, reassuring. Rachel's eyes blurred with tears that had nothing to do with pain. Minutes passed. Then, with a final snap, the rope unraveled. Her arms dropped to her sides, useless at first. Pins and needles screamed up her elbows. She groaned softly and leaned forward, curling over her knees. Major stepped back, panting, his head turned toward her, ears angled to listen. Rachel reached out with both shaking hands, feeling along his neck, burying her fingers in his thick fur. "You found me?" she whispered. The dog didn't move. He just stood there, still as stone, tail low, waiting. Elsewhere in Bear Creek, Helen Parker stood outside the ranger station, coat zipped high to her chin, eyes focused on the trees beyond town. She was not a woman who panicked, but today her heart thudded with a strange mix of certainty and urgency. Inside, Deputy Mark Bishop adjusted his radio and buckled his utility vest. The man had spent 25 years in law enforcement, most of them in towns like this, broad-shouldered and gruff, with deep crow's feet at the corners of his eyes. Mark wasn't prone to superstition, but he respected instinct, and Helen Parker had good instincts. "She's been gone too long," Helen said quietly. Mark nodded. "I know." He glanced down at the notebook she had brought. Evan's latest sketch. Rachel, a tree, a dog with a bandana. "He doesn't draw from imagination," Helen added. "Not like that." Mark looked up. "You think it's real? I think it's enough to start walking." He didn't argue. Back in the woods. Rachel rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She took one step, then another. The third nearly brought her down. But Major moved closer, letting her lean on his side. "You always were the better half of the team," she muttered. They moved together, slowly, through the trees, one limping with age, the other with pain. Rachel didn't know where they were going, but Major did. He paused often to sniff the air, check the wind, adjust course. His blindfold slipped slightly, catching on a twig, and Rachel reached to fix it with trembling fingers. "I've got you," she whispered. Major nuzzled her hip, then kept moving. Rachel leaned heavily on Major's side as they moved deeper into the woods. Her legs trembled with each step, and her breath came in sharp, shallow draws. The taste of iron lingered on her tongue from the split in her lip, and her fingers still ached from the ropes that had bound her. Every movement was a battle between instinct and exhaustion, yet it was not fear that drove her forward. It was trust. Major walked just ahead of her, slightly to the left, his shoulder brushing her thigh when the terrain narrowed. The old German shepherd's yellow blindfold had been knocked askew during the journey, but he didn't seem to notice. His ears twitched constantly, his nose working, pausing only when he sensed danger. Despite the stiffness in his back leg and his blindness, he led with uncanny certainty, choosing trails that twisted away from the open and moved through thickets and brush where scent lingered longest. The woods were still eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling, just the sound of Rachel's boots dragging through wet leaves and the whisper of Major's paws brushing the ground. Then Rachel stopped. There, up ahead, in the faint mist, stood a small, slanted cabin. It sat nestled between a ring of overgrown trees, its roof sagging slightly under years of neglect. One window was cracked, and the door hung crookedly on its rusted hinges. The clearing around it was ringed with disturbed dirt, deep boot prints, and tangled loops of wire. Rachel narrowed her eyes. Snares. And not just a few. At least a dozen wire traps were coiled and stacked beside the porch, some still fresh with bent twigs and bait crumbs. Near the cabin's rear, she spotted a crude pen fashioned from split logs and tarp, and inside it, a movement, a small figure, a young deer, maybe 6 months old, its legs trembling beneath it. The animal's coat was patchy from stress, and its wide eyes blinked slowly as it tried to rise, only to sink back to the muddy floor. Rachel instinctively stepped forward, but Major let out a low growl, not a warning of aggression, but a signal. He stepped in front of her, nose to the air. His body went rigid. Voices. Rachel ducked behind a tree, pulling Major with her. From behind the cabin, 2 men appeared. One was tall and lean, with a green flannel jacket and a bright orange beanie. The other was shorter, stockier, with a hunting vest and a dark beard. They moved without caution, laughing, muttering, one of them chewing sunflower seeds and spitting the shells into the dirt. "Back in an hour," the taller one said. "If it ain't gone by then." "We got it." Rachel's stomach turned. She waited until their footsteps faded completely before exhaling. They needed to get out. Major turned to her. He was still for a long moment, nose working fast, then turned his head toward the eastern tree line. He walked a few steps, then paused to check she was following. She did. Back in Bear Creek, Helen Parker stood in the middle of her late husband's workshop, a small barn just behind the house that hadn't been touched in almost 5 years. Dust floated in golden shafts through the windows, coating the old shelves lined with jam jars full of screws, fishing lures, and notes written in pencil on curled paper. She moved slowly, carefully, until she found the drawer beneath the mounted fly rod. She pulled it open. Inside lay a rolled canvas map, hand-drawn and weather-faded. Her husband, Caleb, had spent decades mapping the lesser trails of the Bear Creek woods, paths the county maps never marked, places known only to locals and deer. Helen brushed her fingers across the ink lines, then took the map and walked back into the house. Deputy Mark Bishop was already in her kitchen. He was tall and serious-looking in his khaki jacket. His gray hair swept back under his ranger's cap, and his radio clipped to his shoulder. He had been waiting, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. Helen unrolled the map across the table. "These paths aren't on anything digital," she said, "but if they're hiding something, they'll do it somewhere forgotten." Mark leaned in, studying the small hand-drawn notes. "What's this marking here? A dry creek bed. But it's deep enough for cover. There used to be a hunting shack nearby. Caleb used it during elk season in the 70s. Mark tapped it. "We'll check it first." Rachel and Major crouched beneath a thicket of low pine, hidden in a shallow hollow just off the ridge near the abandoned cabin. The deer's bleating cries had faded into the distance, and Rachel felt the ache of helplessness settle in her chest. She had counted herself strong for most of her life. She'd served on raids in Denver and search missions in mountain blizzards. But now, crouched in the mud with a blind dog and no weapon, her strength was reduced to patience and trust. Major shifted beside her, ears perked toward the wind. Then, without warning, he moved, brushing against her leg to nudge her deeper into the hollow. Rachel didn't question it. She followed. They settled into the cramped space, roots curling above them like fingers frozen in time. Rachel leaned back against a trunk and exhaled slowly. Major curled beside her, one paw resting over her boot. The dog's chest rose and fell in calm rhythm. Though his ears never stopped twitching, his body was tense, ready, listening. Rachel looked down at him and whispered, "You saved me." The forest stayed silent. Mark's truck rolled slowly down the old fire road, its tires crunching over gravel and moss. Beside him sat Ranger Dana Ellis. Her dark ponytail pulled through the back of her camo cap. Her fingers tapped restlessly on her thigh, her rifle laid flat across her lap. She had joined the search not because she was asked, but because something in her gut wouldn't let her stay at the station. Dana was lean, scarred across her jaw from a motorbike crash at 19, and carried herself like a wolf, alert, cautious, deliberate. Mark pointed ahead. "There's the dry creek." They stopped the truck and stepped out quietly. Dana adjusted her binoculars. "Smoke," she whispered. "Cabin's in use." Mark nodded. "Let's move." The sun was just beginning to split the fog when the two poachers finally left the cabin, unaware of the pair hiding deep in the pine-covered hollow behind them. Their laughter echoed faintly, casual and cruel, as they disappeared down the trail, most likely headed toward another trap line, somewhere farther down the ridge. Rachel Monroe's arms trembled as she leaned against the trunk for support. Her body still hadn't fully forgiven her for the long night. Her ankle was swollen from a misstep in the dark, and her ribs ached from being pressed to the ground for so long. She turned to the dog beside her, Major, the blind German shepherd who had once walked with her into military storms and now walked again by her side in a forest that had tried to bury her. Stood as if waiting for a command. His yellow blindfold was streaked with mud, his coat tangled with pine needles, but his body remained taut, alert, faithful. "We go now," Rachel whispered. She took a step onto the leaf-strewn trail that cut through the woods just east of the cabin. Major moved with her, slowly at first, then steadier. The limp in his back leg had worsened, but he didn't falter, not once. When Rachel stumbled, he paused. When she wavered, he leaned against her, silent but solid. They had barely gone 20 paces when a low voice cut through the trees like a knife. "Sheriff Monroe." Rachel's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself upright. Here she called out, the word rough and ragged. From behind a veil of brush, Deputy Mark Bishop emerged, his boots covered in moss and damp soil. He had his radio clipped to his shoulder, his hand hovering near his sidearm, but the look on his weathered face was one of stunned relief. Beside him stood Ranger Dana Ellis, her brown eyes sharp beneath the brim of her cap, rifle slung safely across her back. Mark reached Rachel in 3 long strides and caught her just before she collapsed. "We've got you now," he murmured. Major stood quietly beside them, panting but still watching the direction the poachers had taken. Dana's voice was cool but focused. "The cabin's clear now. Let's go get that deer." By noon, the forest was alive with movement again. The young deer, spooked but unharmed, was coaxed gently into a trailer by Dana and 2 animal welfare volunteers. One of them, a teenager named Noah Fielding, was no older than 16, with shaggy blonde hair and a gentle demeanor. He had been raised around animals on his family's goat farm and had volunteered for wildlife rescue over the last year. His presence seemed to calm the fawn, and when it trembled, he simply whispered, "You're okay?" "Little one," back near the cabin. 2 officers from Jackson County arrived to arrest the poachers, now cuffed and silent. One of the men had tried to run when he spotted Mark's badge, only to trip over one of his own snares. Irony, as Mark would later say, sometimes did its best work in boots. Rachel sat wrapped in a thermal blanket at the back of the response truck, sipping water while her vitals were checked. She'd refused to go straight to the clinic until she knew the deer had been freed. Major sat next to her the entire time, unmoving. "You sure he's blind?" Dana asked quietly. Rachel looked at him, then smiled. "He sees what matters," back in Bear Creek. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden beams over the rooftops. Helen stood on her porch with a mug of tea, watching the driveway as the county truck came into view. Evan stood beside her, unusually still. When the truck door opened and Rachel stepped out, supported slightly by Mark, Evan dropped his sketch pad. Then he ran. He didn't yell or cry, but he ran straight toward Major, who was just stepping off the back ramp. The old dog lifted his head at the sound of footsteps as Evan neared. Major didn't react the way most dogs might. He didn't wag or bark. Instead, he took one step forward, tilted his head, and waited. Evan dropped to his knees and buried his face in the dog's neck. Rachel approached slowly. Her body was stiff, her gait cautious. She stood beside Helen, whose eyes glistened as she placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. He waited for her. Evan said softly without looking up, just like she waited for him. Rachel smiled. Yes, he did. The weeks that followed moved like water carving stone, slow but permanent. Rachel healed, though her ankle would always have a hitch and her ribs still throbbed when she laughed too hard. She spent most days helping file reports and giving testimony. But her nights had changed. She now spent them writing, not reports, but plans. A proposal. Bear Creek once had a K-9 unit, but after funding cuts and retirements, it had faded into history. Rachel wanted it back. Only this time. Not for tracking fugitives or sniffing out drugs. She wanted it for comfort, for connection, for what Major had done without sight and without orders, with the town's blessing and a quiet grant from the state's Rural Resilience Program. The Bear Creek Comfort K-9 unit was formed, and Major was named the founding partner. One Friday afternoon, Evan stepped into the sheriff's office lobby, holding a large rolled canvas. His fingers were smudged with pastel and charcoal. He walked past two deputies and into the community room where Rachel sat, going over volunteer applications. "I made something," Evan said. Rachel turned. He unrolled the canvas carefully. The painting showed Major, seated beneath a pine tree. His yellow blindfold was tied neatly. His ears were high, and his chest puffed as if listening to a wind no one else could hear. Behind him stood a silhouette of Rachel, one hand resting gently on his head. The background was soft green and golden, like morning mist giving way to sunlight. At the bottom, written in careful black letters, "Kindness doesn't need sight, just heart." Rachel swallowed hard. "Can I hang it here?" Evan asked. She nodded, unable to speak. He placed it near the door. Major lay beside the bench quietly, his body curled into a crescent. He no longer followed her from room to room, not because he was tired, but because he no longer needed to chase. He had found the place he was meant to return to. Rachel sat beside him. Evan joined her, and in the stillness that followed, there was peace, not just in silence, but in knowing that some bonds can find their way even in the darkest woods. Sometimes, the ones who guide us back to the light are not the loudest, the strongest, or even those who can see the path clearly. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones, the forgotten, the broken, the blind, who carry the greatest light within. Major didn't need his eyes to lead Rachel home. He needed only the memory of love, the whisper of a bond that time and darkness could not erase. And maybe that's how God works too, not always with thunder, but through the silent miracles he places in our lives. A child who speaks after years of silence, a dog who walks by faith, a moment that reminds us we are never truly alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a reminder that kindness doesn't need sight, just heart. Leave a comment below and tell us. Have you ever experienced a quiet miracle? Type "Amen" in the comments if you believe God still sends silent angels to guide us home. And if you believe the world still needs stories like this, stories of hope, faith, and second chances, subscribe to our channel. May God bless everyone who chooses love over fear, faith over doubt, and light over darkness.